Good evening to everybody. Now, the last three lectures that we've had were grouped under the heading, Enacting the Public Mission. The intent for using that subheading was to highlight activities designed to engage people beyond the boundaries of the classroom, because such engagement is often identified with the Wisconsin idea. But last week's lecture is noteworthy too for its attention to community, to the recognition that groups, aggregates of people, can matter. As you will recall, then, Professors Ventura, Lawless, and White not only reminded us that people live in and interact with one another, live in communities and interact with one another, but that such interaction is critical for research, education, public service, and advocacy, these efforts of the university. Indeed, the overarching concern for this semester, the concern with democracy, necessarily centers on more than the individual. An overarching question, how do we live together, places groups, communities at the center. This evening's lecture continues the interest in community, and especially in the reach of the Wisconsin idea into small geographical units. Now, last week's lecturers illustrated that the interest in community is a long-standing one, and it's not something consigned to the past of this institution. We could draw on any number of examples to show how the currency of the notion of community. I'll just mention a couple, and this is in part because it's impossible in the course of one semester to cover everything that could be done. But in terms of, if you look at the website, the Wisconsin Idea, you will see an array of initiatives that signify this institution's commitment to public service. An example, the students from the UW-Chapter Engineers Without Borders traveled to Puerto Rico earlier this year to install solar panels at a children's shelter. You may recall this was when Puerto Rico had been hit so badly by the hurricane. Here was an effort then to say, we can do something. We can make a contribution. The university has made noteworthy commitments to community, to the well-being of communities, through its membership in the Campus Compact. This is a compact involving over 400 institutions that all say we are supporting education and community development. The civic action plan that this university established with reference to the Campus Compact regards community engagement as a two-way process. That was something that a number of people in your post talked about, that this isn't just going in one direction, but there is reciprocity, that the university can benefit from the wisdom, the insights, the experiences found in communities. Interactions with communities yield payoffs for university faculty, students, staff, administrators in countless ways. So given the potential for widespread yields is not the probing of community processes in the interest of the university? Mr. Benny Witkovsky would undoubtedly answer yes. He asks us to join him this evening in exploring conflict and inequality within the context of small cities. A key question for him, how do political considerations within small settings affect support for outside politicians? He invites us then to consider the implications of findings from analyses he has conducted consider the implications for the Wisconsin idea, and particularly the connection to the pursuit of democracy. Mr. Witkovsky is a graduate of Vassar College. He's completing his doctoral degree in sociology here at Wisconsin, and he continues with an interest in the civic engagement of Hmong, Latinx, Black, and senior citizens communities. So please join me in welcoming Benny Witkovsky.
I just turned the microphone on. Is that working? Great. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Professor Merritt, for that wonderful introduction. My name is Benny Witkovsky. I'm a graduate student in the sociology department. And today I'm going to be presenting on research that I've done as part of my master's thesis and am building on for my dissertation on local conflict in small cities in Wisconsin and how that local conflict in these cities has laid the foundation that outsider politicians like Donald Trump, like Scott Walker, have used to gain support in these communities. This project in many ways grew out of a sort of what happened in 2016 question. I am from Wisconsin, I grew up here, and I assume like many of you, I was surprised, if not discomfited, by 2016 and by seeing someone like Donald Trump become the first Republican presidential candidate to win this state in almost 30 years. Now, this story of what happened in Wisconsin has been told a number of times in a number of different ways. Some will argue the Democratic Party has simply been outmatched by the Republican partisan apparatus, their advertising, their mobilization strategies. Others will argue that it was Trump's racism or his promise of economic rebirth that played on the anxieties of working class people in communities across the state. Some see this as a rural backlash against the elitism, cultural distance, and egocentrism of urban people like us. And others see that young voters and voters of color didn't turn out in 2016 in the ways that they had before, and see that it was the Democrats' failure to promise those communities real meaningful change that led to Trump's victory in 2016. Now, there's truth, I think, in all of those explanations, but I want to hold up two specific things that I think are often overlooked. First is the politics of small cities, those cities that bridge the gap between rural and urban Wisconsin, between red places and blue places. I'll talk more about what those are, but I think they're a piece that has been largely left out and I want to bring back to the conversation. And second is the role that local politics has played in building these political shifts that we've seen on the ground in the state. First, though, I want to ground this presentation in two aspects of the Wisconsin idea. This is the Wisconsin idea course. First is this claim of the Wisconsin idea that the boundaries of the university should be the boundaries of the state. If we're going to take that seriously, I think that means we have to think very carefully about what the boundaries of the state actually are. What are the boundaries of our political community? Who belongs here and who doesn't? Whose voices are heard and centered, and whose voices are often overlooked? The second part of the Wisconsin idea I want to think about is this idea that the university's mission is to prepare a democratic public for active participation and collective decision-making. For me, in particular, this claim that the university should be preparing a democratic public makes us think about local institutions. What are the local democratic institutions that enable that democratic public? And what are the ways that local political institutions restrict democratic engagement, isolate people, prevent people from really participating in that form of collective decision-making? So these are the two aspects of the Wisconsin idea that I want you to think about throughout this presentation and that I'll be coming back to. So first, the boundaries of the state. When I was growing up in Wisconsin in the 1990s, I was given an image of Wisconsin as a purple state that was fundamentally a state of purple people, right? Universally across Wisconsin, we were a people that weren't quite Republican, weren't quite Democrat, were somewhere in the middle. And there was this kind of good old boy sense of politics that was like backslapping and very like shrouded in this aura of Wisconsin politeness. And that image of what it meant to be a Wisconsin politician or a purple politician that could play in Wisconsin was flexible enough to incorporate Reagan and Bill Clinton, Tommy Thompson, and Jim Doyle, right? We maybe had memories of a Bob La Follette or a Joe McCarthy, these sort of like towering extremists in politics, but we didn't believe that that kind of extremism played in the Wisconsin of the 1990s. And then came the mid-2000s, and we saw the election of Scott Walker, we saw the election of Ron Johnson, we saw a sort of shift in Wisconsin politics that I think led us to think much more about this map. A map of the state that is fundamentally divided between urban centers that are highly, highly democratic, deep blue places like Madison and Milwaukee, and the rest of the state that is deep red, kind of conservative rural communities. So the state that I think we started to believe that we lived in the late 2000s was this kind of deeply divided rural versus urban, red Wisconsin versus blue Wisconsin state. And recognizing this has produced some excellent scholarship and some really important ways of thinking. I know that Kathy Kramer is speaking to this audience in a few weeks. She is sort of, I think, the towering figure in this way of thinking, that what we have seen in Wisconsin with Scott Walker's victory, with Ron Johnson's victory, and Donald Trump's victory is a kind of rural resurgence, a rural anger and resentment that is born out of a sense that elites in the cities have controlled power for too long. Other people, like Daniel Kaufman, in his book, The Fall of Wisconsin, make more of a party organization argument and see that it is the Democratic Party that has learned how to control these cities and the Republican Party that has built an apparatus that controls the rural areas that simply cannot be overcome. And this approach to politics, I think, is very important as we consider what I call the outsider turn in Wisconsin conservatism. So beginning with Scott Walker in 2010, we see here, ironically, Scott Walker is someone who spent his entire adult life working in government, but he runs in 2010 as an anti-government candidate, as a candidate who believes the state bureaucracy has been corrupted. Since they're in the audience, I should be open about the fact that I am the child of state employees, and that will tell you some of my background. But right, so Scott Walker runs in 2010 saying that public employees are corrupt, that we need to start running the state like a business, privatizing those aspects of state government that had traditionally been public. At the same time, Ron Johnson also is elected senator. He's someone who has never served in government and particularly pitches his non-governmental experience, his business experience, as his primary qualification for why he is going to be a good servant of the public interest. 6 years later, Donald Trump really combines these two aspects of the outsider politician. He's never served in government, as we know. He's a business person who pitches his business experience as his primary qualification. And he runs kind of in an antagonistic fashion toward the government, toward bureaucracy, his pitch to drain the swamp and to return political power to those forgotten people who've been overlooked for too long. Now, in the sort of rural-urban divide narrative, we see this outsider turn as fueled by the fact that parts of the state have been left behind, that parts of the state have been left out for generations and see no hope in the way that the government has traditionally been run and are pushing for these extreme changes in this outsider politics to finally be included again. And while there might be some truth to that, and I do think there is some truth to that, I think the picture gets more complicated when we consider the experience of small cities in Wisconsin. There are about 29 cities in this state that are between 25,000 people and a little over 100,000 people. That's every city that is bigger than Fitchburg and smaller than Madison in this state. And those cities in those cities, we see about a quarter of the state's voters, about a quarter of the state's population in these cities. It's about, I think, 1.4 million people. And those cities bridge the rural-urban divide. They bridge red and blue America. They're profoundly mixed places. Some of these places are suburbs, some of them are old industrial cities, some are college towns, some are agricultural centers. And for me, it's the experience of small cities that shows us that thinking purely about the conflict between distant, isolated parts of the state doesn't tell us the whole story. That we also have to look within communities themselves, look within these cities to see how conflict and inequality on the ground in these communities is part of fueling that resentment, part of fueling that sense that traditional politics and the democratic system will never provide for certain communities, and outsiders who promise extreme solutions may be the only hope. To show you a little bit more about the kind of mixedness of these cities, in 2016, these cities were slightly more democratic than the state as a whole, but that kind of average overlooks broad division across these cities. Some of the cities, Trump won by 20, even 40 points. Some of the cities, Clinton won by margins just as big. And that result was represented shifts from 2012 to 2016 of 10 to 20 points in some cities toward Trump and 10 to 20 points in other cities towards Clinton. 2018 shows us a continuance of this very mixed politics in these cities. So many of the cities that swung toward Trump end up swinging back in 2018 and giving significantly higher votes to Tony Evers. And many of the cities that swung toward Clinton and Trump did poorly swing back toward Walker, and Walker overperforms in those communities. Only a handful of cities get more and more conservative from 2016 to 2018, and only Fitchburg and Sun Prairie get more and more liberal from 2016 to 2018. And if this kind of experience across these cities, across these years, doesn't show the mixedness of these politics, the division within the cities, I think, makes this even clearer. So if we look on a neighborhood by neighborhood level in these cities, in 2016, Clinton or Trump only got 60% or more of the vote in 20% of the neighborhoods in these cities. So in 80% of the neighborhoods in these cities, it was almost 50-50 support for Clinton and support for Trump. This distance grows a little bit in 2018, given the shifts that I was talking about, and it's about 40% of the neighborhoods in these cities that give either Walker or Evers 60% of the vote or more. And this stands in contrast to the urban centers in this state, where in Madison in 2016, every single neighborhood gave Clinton more than 60% of the vote, and in Milwaukee, 85% of the neighborhoods gave Clinton more than 60% of the vote. And in the 5 most rural counties, the 5 counties with the lowest population density, it's about 50 to 60% of the reporting units, the wards in those communities, gave one of these candidates 60% of the vote or more. So this very narrow division on a neighborhood by neighborhood level, I think is really a unique characteristic to these small cities, and important for us to understand how these small cities work. And for me, it's that close division within neighborhoods that points to the importance of local politics. What is it that is happening in these communities, within these governments, within these neighborhoods, that leads some people to vote for people like Hillary Clinton and Tony Evers, and some people to believe that the system has been corrupted, that the swamp needs to be drained, and that their only hope is to vote for Donald Trump. Now, this idea that the role that local politics and local institutions play in shaping people's faith in democracy, people's faith in the political system, is an old idea in sociology. Alexis de Tocqueville, those of you who are sociologists know, he's a person who came to the United States in the 1800s and wrote long diaries about how democracy worked in this country, considered a sort of proto-sociologist. He wrote, "Local institutions are to liberty what primary schools are to science. They put it within people's reach. They teach people how to appreciate its peaceful enjoyment and accustom them to make use of it." So this idea that it is what we do on a local level that teaches us that democracy can work. And we see this continuing in the sociological thought through people like Robert Putnam and Seymour Martin Lipset, who believed that kind of local engagement, local democracy was what built people's trust in the system, built people's tolerance for the slow and messy work of democracy, and taught people that that system should be engaged with and was worth participating in. In today's era, where most of us are convinced that the federal government isn't working, that Washington is broken and stagnant, and that state government is also not working, that the state legislature isn't accomplishing anything, many see local government as the sort of last hope for really getting things done in our communities. So James and Deborah Fallows are journalists, and I think James Fallows is also a political scientist, but I'm not 100% sure about that, that have written this book called Our Towns, where they, in the last few years, they travel across the country to different small towns around the country and see that, like, in those towns, people are still coming together and putting aside their partisan differences and cooperating and getting things done. And they see it as this kind of like holier, purer, cleaner version of democracy. So this idea that local politics is very important, I think, is an old one and an important one. But what I want to say is it's not simply respect for democracy. It's not simply trust in the system that can bubble up from people's experience in local government and affect their voting on a state and national level. It is also that experience of feeling left out of local government, of feeling ignored by local government, of feeling powerless in the face of local government, that can teach people that the system is broken, that the system is corrupt, and that their only hope is for the system to be destroyed in order for them to gain some kind of power in their communities. So now I'm going to show you a little bit about how I think this works through a case study of one small city in Wisconsin, which I'm calling Wisconsin City. It's a small city in the sort of 50,000 to 100,000 range of population. It's its own city. It's not really a suburb. It's outside of other major metropolitan areas. It's an old industrial city that has witnessed these kind of cycles of decline and reinvestment that we've come to hear so much about. It's over 90% white. It's extremely white. And it's historically very, very Republican, but has been growing increasingly liberal over the past 30 years or so. And within Wisconsin City, I'm going to tell you about two communities in particular. The first I'm calling the neighborhood. The neighborhood is sort of the traditional heart of the working class community in Wisconsin City. It's on the city's south side. It was the sort of heart of the union part of the city when the city had factories that were producing things. And now that deindustrialization has shaped the community so much, it is a growing precarious community, dependent on retail jobs, irregular work, and things like that. It's also traditionally the home to white ethnic communities, where on the north side, I'll talk about in a second, was older populations that had lived in the state for many generations. The south side, the neighborhood, were people who came in the early 20th century, around World War I into World War II, and were clearly a different ethnic community than the rest of the city. And it is historically extremely democratic, but has become increasingly more and more split in the last several decades. And Trump was the first Republican to win the neighborhood as a presidential candidate since 1992, when George H.W. Bush won it. But we have to remember 1992 was a three-way race, so everything was messy then. It was a very long time since Republicans had played in this neighborhood. On the other side of the economic spectrum and the other side of the city, I'm talking about a place I'm calling the Village. The Village is a very wealthy part of the city on the north side. It's the traditional home of business leaders, university professors, and other elites. It used to be one of the most conservative parts of the city through the 1990s and the 2000s, but has grown increasingly more liberal in recent years. And this division between the neighborhood and the village, it's important to say, is emblematic of a broader division between the south side and the north side of the city that has dominated local politics for at least 60 years, if not 100 years. I'm not going to say too much about my methods. If you want to ask me more, I can talk about this more later. But I did interviews with about 30 local leaders, participants, and activists in the community. I did observations at about 50 different local events. Some of these are political events, some of these are sort of neighborhood events. And I also did some time just sort of hanging out in the neighborhood and watching people. And I did archival research in local newspapers, government documents, and election results. So the first thing I want to show you is that inequality within Wisconsin City is real and is important to people on the ground here. So what I've done is I collected a number of kind of measures of participation in local government, and I'm showing you how it varies from between the different parts of the city. So the city council is elected at large. There aren't ward-based representatives. They're at-large representatives, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And since that form of government was created in the 1950s, the North Side has had the vast majority of city council members, and the South Side has been considerably underrepresented. The city government isn't the city council is not the only way that citizens participate in local government. There's also about 150 seats on local boards and commissions that the mayor appoints. And here too, we see that over the last 10 years, there's been significant overrepresentation of the North Side and underrepresentation of the South Side. The only measure where the South Side actually overperforms the North Side is in turnout in local elections. I averaged this over 5 years. This is in large part because the university is on the city's north side, and the student wards have dramatically low participation. If there are students in the room, vote in your local elections. They are important. Right? And if we look between the village and the neighborhood, this discrepancy is even more pronounced. The neighborhood hasn't had a resident on city council in more than 50 years. The village alone is responsible for 10% of the seats on city council. The neighborhood is underrepresented on boards and commissions. The village dramatically overrepresented. The village has 40% turnout in local elections compared to 25%, 26% turnout in the neighborhood. So we see here this consistent pattern of overrepresentation of some parts of the city and underrepresentation of other parts. And if we look here, we see that Trump's performance in the city largely maps on to those patterns of inequality. So Trump gained in every part of the city. It's important to know, right? Trump gained everywhere. He gained in every part of the city. But his gains were deepest on the South Side, in the part of the city that's been systematically underrepresented. And if we look here in the difference between the village and the neighborhood, we see really a dramatic difference here. He only gains 4 points over Mitt Romney's performance in the village, but he gains 20 points over Mitt Romney's performance in the neighborhood. Like I said, becoming the first Republican to carry this working class part of the city in many, many years. And again, if we compare those measures of local incorporation by the wards that Trump won and the wards where he did particularly well and the wards that Clinton won, we see again a sort of consistent discrepancy in their incorporation in local government. Trump's wards averaged 1.5 seats on city council, Clinton's 2.5. Trump's wards averaged 15 seats on boards and commissions, Clinton's 24 seats. And in the wards where Trump had his best performances versus the wards where he had his worst performances, those differences are even more pronounced. So all of this leads me to say that there's at least something we should think about in the way that local government works, the way that people experience local government, and why they might be attracted to an outsider candidate that promises to disrupt the system and drain the swamp, like Donald Trump. Now, you might tell me that this is kind of all to be expected and all very natural, right? There are many reasons why Donald Trump did very well in working class communities. I talked about a few of them. I'm sure you all have your favorite pet theories that you will share with me later. And also there are many reasons why we simply expect working class people to participate in local government less. That, again, might not be surprising. But I want to tell you, by digging into the history of this a little bit, is that this dynamic, that working class people are underrepresented and local power is concentrated in the hands of a few, is a product of historical struggle. A very long fight in this city about how city government should be organized, about how local power should be distributed. Now, to take a step back, because this is the Wisconsin idea, class. it was always important to the purveyors of the Wisconsin idea to think about how the university could help local governments be run in a clean, bureaucratic, predictable, scientific, rational way. And so for generations, purveyors of the Wisconsin idea gave local governments the tool to try and clean up government. And for those of you who are in the class, and I believe read Professor Goldberg's introduction to the Wisconsin idea, he talks about how there's a tension endemic to the Wisconsin idea between bureaucratic, clean government and people-powered democratic government. And this tension is dramatically felt on the ground in Wisconsin City. So in the 1950s, elite leaders in the community, and I have not found in the records them referencing the Wisconsin idea, but they are clearly informed by elements of the Wisconsin idea. Elite leaders looked around at city government and they saw a South Side mayor and his cronies who were South Side councilmen and saw that the city was run by patronage politics, sectarianism, short-sightedness. As one local leader described to me, the city was divided into little bitty fiefdoms where everyone looked out only for what was happening on their blocks, and it was impossible to plan anything on a citywide basis because no one would agree with each other. And so looking at that, fearing that patronages and sectarianism, a group of local elites, and these are like the most elite elites you can imagine. This local organizing committee initially was the editor of the newspaper, a minister, a banker, and the president of the local Masonic temple, right? It was like the most elites you can imagine, mobilized to try and reform local government and change local government. In 1957, they force a referendum that they ultimately pass. And what they do with this referendum is they abolish neighborhood-based wards and replace it with at-large city council members. They replace the elected mayor with a professional city manager, and they kick the parties out of local politics. They make sure that local politics is entirely nonpartisan. And this referendum, when it finally gets passed in 1957, is clearly divided across city lines. So the referendum loses in every single ward on the south side in the working class part of town and wins in every ward except for one on the north side in the wealthier part of town. And immediately after this referendum passes and they change the form of government, the south side loses power. They go from being guaranteed 6 of 16 seats, about 40% of seats in the old government form of government, to averaging about 1 out of every 7 seats in the new form of government, about 15% of seats. And that breakdown in distribution of city council seats has basically been constant for the last 60 years. And the South Side, needless to say, is not happy about this, and they immediately start mobilizing to try and change the form of local government back. 2 years later, they force another referendum, and again in that referendum, the North Siders far overperform in support for the new form of government, and the South Side is where support for the old form of government is, but they lose again. And now, after that initial referendum in 1957, and then the first attempt to go back in 1959, every 8 to 10 years, there's a new referendum in the city trying to reform local government, trying to go back to this old system where working class people on the south side thought they had more power. And almost every time these referenda are caused by some South Sider believing that the city government has bungled a project in the South Side, that they've screwed something up, they've ignored the South Side, that the city government is being run in a corrupt way, and South Siders are losing, and so they try and force these referenda. Interestingly, the role of the university switches over time as well. So in the local university, I think, was very supportive of the initial change to a council manager government, an at-large city council, professional city manager government. But as we get to the 90s, I think professors and students start to realize that they are among the underrepresented communities whose voices might be heard better if, like in Madison, there was a designated ward that students would represent because it would be the student neighborhood. Again, for those students in the office, I believe that seat on that ward in Madison is currently vacant, and they're looking for people to apply for it. So, but importantly, in this time, the neighborhood loses all power in local government. The neighborhood has never had a city council member elected at large. Southsiders and people in the neighborhood are just constantly complaining, constantly convinced that their needs aren't being met by this form of government and that their needs would be better met in some other form. And this comes, I hear this all the time. Like, we needed a new crosswalk built so that our kids could cross the street safely and go to school, and we could not get city council to take it up. But the very week that people on the north side wanted bike paths built in their neighborhood, that came up on city council's agenda. There was massive flooding in the city a few years ago that destroyed homes on the south side. And now the city's like redesigning streets and redesigning parks on the south side, but not addressing that flooding problem. And people on the south side are convinced that if they were represented, those problems would be solved. On the flip side, what happens is because there's been this history of tension and division in the city, for those people who are in power, for those people who are kind of doing well in this form of government, any talk about neighborhood balance, any talk that part of the city is being left out and part of the city is being over-invested in is considered reactionary, considered divisive, sectarian, looking back, and unproductive. Now, at the same time that the South Side loses and the neighborhood loses representation in city government, they also lose their distinct partisan identity. In the 1940s and 50s, the South Side consistently voted 30 to 40 points more liberal than the rest of the city. This is the heart of kind of the democratic politics in the city. Today, the South Side and the neighborhood are almost equally divided between Democrats and Republicans, maybe a few points more conservative than the city as a whole in recent elections. And both Republicans and Democrats really struggle to recruit membership from the South Side, volunteers, leaders from the South Side. They're all dominated by politicians on the north, by volunteers on the north side and in the suburban kind of outerlying parts of the county. As one of the few neighborhood activists who is a leader in the Democratic Party explained to me, she said, people in the neighborhood are just getting by. They just think life is easier if I don't have one more thing on my plate to think about, and that one extra thing that I can get rid of is politics. So this community has lost its power in local government and lost its partisan identity over the course of the same time. And what's really important for me and for us to think about is what's the relationship between those two things. So there's a sociologist named Josh Pasevich, who we can forgive him. He does his research in Iowa, not in Wisconsin, but I think it's still relevant. And he argues that what has happened in our cities across the state, across the Midwest primarily, is politics has become increasingly divided between those people who are deeply engaged in local government, who run local government, and because they run local government and want to protect it, are afraid of partisan politics and keep politics out, keep partisanship out of their political decisions. And he calls those people partners. They're the people who make local decisions, are competing for capital investment and federal grants, and think that partisanship is going to harm their ability to do that. And on the flip side, he sees a population called partisans, who are the people who've been shut out of local government, who can't gain power through local government, and so they've become the leaders of the political parties, because they think if they inject partisanship into local government, that's their route to local power. Now, I think that framework, that way of understanding things, is really powerful and really important and helps us in a lot of ways. But the story I just told you about the neighborhood, the story I just told you about the South Side, is one of a community that is simultaneously excluded from local government and excluded from party politics. So I want to expand Pasevich's way of thinking about things to include this community that I'm calling peripherals. People who are on the periphery of both local government and party politics. We can also think about people, probably like yourselves, who we might call politicos, people who are at the center of local government and party politics that can easily move between both of those aspects. Side note, I've been really interested in the F-35 controversy in Madison as an example of that. As a community of people, Madison activists and leaders who have no trouble simultaneously lobbying Satya to make local decisions and Tammy Baldwin to make federal decisions, right? So that's the political side of things. But in the neighborhood and on the South Side, we see peripherals. People who see neither local government nor party politics as their path forward on political issues. And it is those people, I want to argue, and I will argue, that have been a particularly good audience for the outsider politicians like Walker, like Johnson, like Trump, who simultaneously tell you, especially Trump, right, simultaneously tells you the bureaucratic government system isn't working and the parties aren't very good, right? Like Trump didn't run saying the Republican Party is great and we should all participate in normal Republican politics, right? He ran saying the parties are corrupt and the government is corrupt, which is why I think he did so well with this community that I'm calling peripherals. Now, what I need to convince you of next, which I will try to tell you, is that these things can be connected, right? That we can actually look and see the ways in which this experience of local politics might bubble up into people's perspectives on state and national politics and the way that they perform in these elections. And I'm going to do that in two ways. First, I want to talk about the demand side of this, how this experience in local politics causes people to demand new forms of political options, outsider politicians that will change the system. And then I'm going to talk about the supply side of this, how it is that those outsider politicians can take advantage of local conflict, can take advantage of local inequality and use it to their benefit. So on the demand side, I think what happens is that this local experience just furthers people's beliefs that the system is broken. But I think it does it in a more personal way and in a more painful way than often our experiences in state or national politics. I think many of us, and I think many people in communities like this, expect national politics to be broken. They expect state politics to be broken. But they don't expect their neighbors, they don't expect their city council to ignore their needs. And so I think what happens is we see here that people have really negative experiences with local government, and that experience poisons their perspectives on all government. So one woman who lives in the neighborhood and really became a neighborhood activist. She was like organizing the neighborhood association, the neighborhood committee. I interviewed her and I told her a little bit about what I was doing and interviewing politicians, and she like rolled her eyes at me and groaned. And I was like, what's going on? And she said, God, I just would not want to spend my time talking to politicians all day. They're not bad people. It's just not anything that I want to be involved with. Another guy I met in the neighborhood was a little bit more colorful, and he told me, I go to those city council meetings and I come out dumber every time. Those politicians have been in there for too long and they need to get out. And this, not only does this sort of taint people's perspective on politicians, but it also undermines the ability of government to provide services to these communities and to prove its worth in these communities. So the city decided to redevelop a playground in the neighborhood, to build, to take an old park and replace the playground equipment and make it nicer. And they got so much pushback, so much vitriol directed toward the city for playground equipment. I was at this meeting in the neighborhood where this woman, she got the proxy votes of a bunch of people who lived around the park. And she came there and she was just furious. And she was like, who is making the decision to put money into this park? Why are we investing in playground equipment and not in security in this park? I'm mad because you aren't listening to me. I feel like my voice isn't being heard, and that's why I'm cranky. And then she got up and stormed out of the meeting. And this is I have never seen people so angry about playground equipment. But it is this kind of perspective that government is broken, that politicians can't be trusted, that then really undermines the ability of government to prove itself to people. So why wouldn't you think that the system is corrupt, that the system is broken? Because they're not doing anything in your neighborhood, in part because you aren't letting them. This inequality also means that people's traditional avenues of civic engagement are relatively rare and relatively blocked. Again, it's an old idea in sociology that civic engagement is part of how we learn that democracy is good and democracy is worth participating in. But what we see in this part of the city is that the inequality in local government is mirrored in the inequality in broader civic organizations. Groups like the League of Women Voters, the political parties, the Chamber of Commerce, all their leaderships from the north side, they can't get anyone to join from the south side. Even when the city launches these neighborhood associations, there's like 12 of them on the north side and 2 of them on the south side, and the ones on the south side can't get enough resources, can't get enough volunteers to make the city's investment worthwhile in those neighborhood associations. The Democratic Party tried to develop a South Side organizing team during the 2018 elections, kind of building on this idea that maybe you're familiar with, that like if your neighbors tell you who to vote for, you're more likely to listen to them. But they couldn't get enough volunteers, and the South Side team had to fold because they just could not get people from the neighborhood, from the South Side to join it. And even those few people who do get involved, oftentimes their involvement teaches them that the system is broken, right? I watched one guy walk out of a Democratic Party meeting and be like, I'm tearing up my membership card. They have nothing to offer me. They're terrible, right? And this again and again I hear from people who do engage that it is their engagement that teaches them that the system is broken and that their demand for outsider politics is necessary. So now on the supply side, I think about kind of 2 ways that outsider politicians interact with this local conflict and this local inequality. One is indirectly. And this is where they don't specifically name local conflict, they don't specifically engage with local conflict, but they put forward a message that resonates with people's experience of local inequality and local conflict. And this is what I see as kind of the way racial politics played out in the 2016 election in Wisconsin City. So at the same time that Trump was sort of gaining steam on the national level, the city, Wisconsin City, was kind of caught up in a debate about whether or not the city should hire a full-time diversity coordinator to ensure that racial minorities were being hired by the city government and were engaging in city programs. And this proposal got just dramatic and significant pushback from people across the city, and particularly people on the south side and in the neighborhood. They said the city was being social engineers. The city was kind of putting its face in things that didn't matter, that this was about personal issues and personal responsibility and not something the city should get involved in. Or simply that the city had misguided priorities. As this guy talks about, he said, like, the city is somewhere around $200 million in debt. We don't have jobs. We don't have economic security. And we're talking about these nonsense issues that aren't going to change our situation anyway. And I think that this really resonated with Trump's message that Elijah Cummings just passed away, right? And so I think it's a good moment to think about the way Trump has talked about the city of Baltimore and the way he has said again and again about cities around the country that city governments have sold out the real residents of those cities in favor of racial minorities, right? That was his message in Baltimore, in Chicago, in Milwaukee when he campaigned in Milwaukee. And I think that that's this message that resonated with this community who felt like their needs weren't being heard, their needs weren't being met at the same time that the city was trying to expand its diversity initiatives and help communities of color in the city. But as I said, I think this is indirect, right? No, Trump never mentioned the city. He never really talked about diversity coordinators. He wasn't directly engaging with this local conflict. There are other times, though, in which the connections are much more obvious and much clearer. So in this city, around the same basic time, there was an extensive conflict about the way the city inspected rental properties and the relationship between the city and landlords. And so the city wanted to increase rental inspections on these landlords, on these rental properties. Many of these landlords are themselves working class. Many of them live in the neighborhood in the South Side. They own kind of like 100-year-old duplexes that they at least will tell me, they make very little money off of. So any kind of change in the inspection regime, in the way these are regulated, really threatens their economic security in the way they think about it. And that conflict started like some of these other local conflicts I've been telling you about. It was sort of not really clear that there was any partisan division. It was just the sense that like the neighborhood was being left out, the neighborhood was being ignored. But then partisans saw this as an opportunity to engage in local politics and take advantage of this local conflict. So the Chamber of Commerce actually gets involved and starts trying to run candidates against the local government on an explicit, like outsider, conservative, pro-landlord, anti-rental inspection platform. So they get 3 to 4 people who had never served in city government to run against all the incumbents. They put forth an explicit conservative message. It's one of the few times that the Republican Party actually endorsed a member for a local election. And at the same time that this local fight is happening, where local nonpartisan conflict is turned into a partisan debate, the state legislature gets involved, and the state Republican and Democratic parties get involved. A nearby state Republican in the state legislature introduces a bill that specifically targets this city and its rental inspection regime, and the nearby Democrats come out against this bill. They hold a hearing in the state legislature, and all of these landlords from the city travel to Madison and testify on behalf of the Republicans. All the city officials travel to Madison and testify on behalf of the Democrats. On the ground in the city, we see that these challenger candidates outperform in the wards Trump won. They outperform on the south side. They dramatically lose the more liberal wards in the north side. And the landlords themselves start to become more and more explicitly conservative. So I know one landlord, a local leader in the landlord organization, who is from the neighborhood, grew up in the neighborhood, and owns several properties there. I met him at a Democratic brat fry, like you do, and he told me he was kind of a Democrat, but also kind of a libertarian. And by the end of this whole fight, he had a "Re-elect Scott Walker" sign in his front yard. So I think we see here this kind of the way that local conflict can be directly taken over for partisan interests. And we can see in some instances the direct exploitation of local inequality to build a partisan platform or a platform for an outsider politician. Now, I want to say I've been talking a lot about one city. Most of my research is in one city, but I don't think there's any reason for us to believe this is unique to this city. If we look across the state, there are several other cities that have this very particular form of government, this council manager form of government. And in almost every one of them, I've heard someone claim that the government is unequally distributed, that all the city council members live in one neighborhood and no one lives in these other neighborhoods. And most of these cities have at some point had calls for change to the system of government. Other cities that do have mayors and neighborhood-based representatives have seen kind of really competitive local elections, often premised on this idea that certain communities are left out, certain communities are ignored, that local politics is unequal. And then other cities have seen kind of really fierce fights about corruption and malfeasance. There are cities that have recalled their mayors and city council members. There are city council members who've been sued for kind of inappropriate behavior in office. So I think that we should look across the state at how people experience local government and how those experiences of local government translate into their kind of broader political perspectives. Now, as I said, Professor Goldberg writes about how this balance, but this conflict between bureaucratic, clean government and democratic, people-powered government is endemic to the Wisconsin idea. And he cites in his article a few conservatives who sort of say it's time to throw out the Wisconsin idea, that university people like you have been trying to fix local government for generations and have done nothing but screw it up more, and it's time that we kind of abandon that idea. I don't think we need to go that far to think that the balance that has been struck between bureaucracy and democracy, between expert-informed government and people-powered government in the 1950s could be renegotiated today. That we might find new ways of organizing our political life that might be a little bit more equal and a little bit more inclusive. And we see this happening on the ground in some of these communities. So in Wisconsin City, they just elected a new mayor who won in part by mobilizing people from these disengaged neighborhoods. One of her first acts in office was to kick a bunch of people off of boards and commissions and try and bring new blood into the system. She also announced that she would hold listening sessions in every single neighborhood in the city to try and build that inclusive setup. In other cities across the state, we've seen kind of attempts to bring new people into the system, whether it's people of color, students, or other women, or other minorities. We've also seen an interesting move of the political parties themselves to start engaging in local government again. As part of the Wisconsin idea and other things that have happened over the last 100 years, the political parties have largely been kicked out of local government. And we've typically thought that was a good thing, right? That partisanship would mean that local government would be less effective and efficient. But what we're seeing now is these parties saying, you know what, we have values, we have things we care about, And those things happen on a local level, and there's a value to offering mass participation and mass mobilization in local elections to fight for our values on a local level. Now, one question I want to end on, because of this is the Wisconsin Idea Lecture, is what is the university's role in all of this? Part of this I want to say is that scholars and students are already engaged in this process. They're already engaged in exploring local inequality, documenting exclusion and change, and informing city governments and those people who mobilize for change about that inequality and what could be done to change it. The other thing I think that's important for us to think about is we too are a local community with needs and interests, and particularly students, particularly our students, are underserved populations, often by local government. And the act of pushing for student representation can also be an act of expanding what it means to be a resident of these communities and to wield political power in these communities. In Wisconsin City, the city council member who pushed for a community-wide conversation on diversity and the diversity coordinator was a local college student who had managed to get elected to city council. So I think we can see that act of empowering students as one that might also help other minorities in the community. But we also have to recognize that the university is a part of what drives conflict and inequality in local politics, that people may reflexively oppose policies or initiatives that are seen as being driven by those people at the university, and that town-gown conflict is very real, and we need to be careful about exacerbating it. So I think we need to be reflexive in our position as scholars, as students, as university people, about what we have to offer movements and how we can participate in them without co-opting them and making them unproductive. Okay, that's all I got. Thank you all.
Observations and listening. I always, lectures have connections. And in this case, I'm sure a number of you recall the lecture by Dean Hess, in which she was very much interested in polarization, but not necessarily trying to identify all the forces associated with polarization. But from this lecture, we can try to look and understand a lot more about local kinds of forces that might be at play. And so I'm certain that there will be people who will be thinking about those sorts of connections, and of course, the question about Wisconsin Idea and how that can get played out. But at this point, why don't we have questions, comments?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd like to point out is, I mean, this question or this discovery about how reactionary some of the politics is in upper Wisconsin is really nothing new. I mean, I became aware that there was still a problem back in the late 80s during the treaty demonstrations, the spearfishing issue around Lac du Flambeau, when, you know, local residents all showed up with signs calling the Native Americans, calling them timber niggers and forest niggers. And I mean, that's what woke me up to the polarization that exists. So I don't think it's really anything new. It's just that people have suddenly woken up to it. Then the second part of my point is, in doing research like this, I mean, we're up against this problem that Wisconsin's local elections are officially nonpartisan, yet we all know perfectly well that the political parties are represented and that these candidates are active in those parties. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into consideration, and I think that's something that probably makes research like yours difficult. Thanks.
Thank you. So absolutely it's nothing new. And one of my next steps in this research is to start doing some of that historical research, to preview research I haven't done yet. I think my plan is to look at the 1992 election and Ross Perot's campaign and the 1968 election and George Wallace's campaign and see how we saw kind of similar dynamics at work in those eras. To your point about partisanship, it's an excellent point, but in this city in particular, it might not be true in every city, in this city in particular, there's an incredible amount of work that is done to make local politics actually nonpartisan. So I think it's easy for us to look at it and say, no, they're all partisans, they're just not telling us their partisan affiliation. But in this community, there really is a real emphasis on making it nonpartisan, and part of that is about how we get this exclusion. Because by kicking the parties out, by kicking people who appear too partisan out, we make it harder for certain communities to participate in local government.
So I was struck by one thing you said. You talked about engagement teaches those people who are getting engaged that the system is broken, which is kind of discouraging. On the other hand, if it's broken, well, we need to know. But could you elaborate a little bit on that? What parts of it strike people as being broken?
Yeah. No. I have a few examples of it. So, like, some of it is someone who, like, is a local public employee and becomes the head of a local union. And in part of that, he becomes a kind of major negotiator with the city government. And it's that experience where he sees city politics from the inside that he realizes that there's like a lot more going on in city politics than anyone else notices. So more knowledge shows people more ways that the system can be corrupted. That's one example of it. Others are people who I know one guy who made the leap to try and run for a partisan state legislative office and didn't get the support he expected to get from the local Republican Party. And it was like that experience that taught him that the local Republican Party wasn't living up to its values. So I think, right, we all know that the organizations we're a part of have their problems. They don't work the way we think they should. And I think it's that experience that often kind of just like reinforces the idea among people who do get involved that like it's not quite right.
Something else that happened in 2010 that I'm sure you know is that Republicans won control of the state legislature and used that to redraw the districts because it was a census year and gerrymander themselves into power, which lasts until this day. What role do you think that plays in making people less satisfied with their state government? And in addition to that, do you think that the voter ID laws that they passed after that, which disproportionately impact communities of color, have played a role in what you're talking about?
Great. So I think the gerrymandering question is super important. But the aspect that I think of it that is even more important as an academic and as a scholar is that, and local activist, is that gerrymandering makes it even harder to track this history and to look at how these wards behave over time. Because if I look at like Ward 12 in 2016 and then I look at Ward 12 in 2008, those aren't the same thing. And so you can't track that history. So part of sociologist Pierre Bourdieu talks about the power of the state as the power to make and break communities. And I want to write an article someday when I have time about that and gerrymandering and how it's that power to reshape the way we think of communities and the way we see our connections, our shared experiences. So the very act of abolishing wards on a local level or redrawing districts on a state and national level is an act of preventing people from recognizing their shared exclusion and their shared inequality. Voter ID is, I think, a really important point. I haven't really addressed it or gotten into it here, but there's clearly systematic underparticipation of communities of color. And so one story I didn't talk about is there's one African-American woman in the town who wanted to run for city council, and she like launched an exploratory committee, got some friends to help her figure it out, and they just couldn't get the information. So it's not just ID, but it's information about how do you vote, how do you register, how do you file papers, when are the deadlines, all of these things that if you know the system, if you're embedded in the system and your friends are embedded in the system, you can figure out. But if you're in an underserved community and trying to seek new power for your community, it's incredibly difficult.
Thanks for a great presentation, of course. I'm interested in a more subsidiary point that you were talking about as part of this research, specifically as it relates to volunteerism and some of the challenges that you alluded to with respect to organizations securing volunteers. And so I'm wondering, if you could say a bit more about what that looked like within this community?
Yeah, so as I said, like there's a real inequality in local participation, right? So most of the organizations draw their volunteers, draw their activists from the north side, from the better incorporated communities. That is less true, I think, in more traditional, like on-the-ground community service volunteering. Like I know some people in the neighborhood, like serve lunch at the school or like do church volunteering. I didn't end up talking a whole lot about that, so I don't have a lot on that. But the more political things get, the more I think that inequality is exacerbated. And the thing that I'm also really interested in is how the belief that there's a shortage in volunteers justifies a lot of exclusionary politics, right? So we assume that not enough people want to get involved. We assume that there aren't enough people who are going to run for local office or join the organization. And because we bake that assumption in, we don't think it's a problem that there are communities that are underrepresented, because like no one wants to be a part of this. And so if people aren't here, it's because they don't want to be. It's not because there are these systematic barriers to engagement.
Along the same lines, when you're trying to draw people out from other communities, especially the kind of communities you're talking about, have you gotten any insight into how you can motivate them to overcome that apathy and the way they feel about the system?
I wish I did. I do worry about framing it as apathy, right? To go back to Bourdieu for a second, I'm sorry, but he's got a great line that talks about how we should really view indifference toward politics as impotence toward politics. And it's people's inability to accomplish things. It's the repeated attempt to make their will known, to shape what's going on in their communities, and the repeated failure that makes them indifferent. And so I think seeing some success can be a part of guarding against that disengagement.
I think we'd also have you invite you back to other lectures, because as Betty said at the beginning, Kathy Kramer is going to be here. And one of the things that she emphasizes a lot is listening and trying to understand. So rather than knowing at the outset what might be the sorts of forces, she says, we've got to listen and learn. And that's why I began the conversation by saying that it's a two-way street. So how do we learn enough to know what sorts of directions to be taken? But great question. Let's see, we've got...
That was a great presentation, Benny. Thank you so much. My question was about the elites you mentioned from like the north side who are kind of dominating building these counties. And I guess I'd be curious to know like what is, because we use some value neutral terms like efficiency, things are not getting done. But I'm wondering from the perspective of the people in the South, whether they agree on what needs to get done or what is efficient or what is, you know what I mean? So maybe even those seemingly neutral terms are not universally accepted between the North and South.
Absolutely.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. So oftentimes, what some of these North Side leaders, elite leaders, say is efficient, is kind of best practices, is the best way of getting things done, is felt as exclusionary to people on the South Side, right? One of the key kind of ways that this plays out, particularly in a council manager form of government, is nothing gets brought to city council, or rarely things get brought to city council until city staff knows exactly what they want to happen and how the vote should happen. And so everything's hammered out before it ever gets in front of a public meeting. And so that is efficient, right? It's the city government using its resources, using the expertise of its staff to make the best possible decisions, and then getting a stamp of approval from elected officials. But to people in the neighborhood, to the Southsiders who don't see what's happening behind closed doors, it reads as corrupt. It reads as you're not really taking input. You have your mind made up before the meeting even starts.
So, Benny, if you're the Democratic candidate for president in 2020,
I'm still too young, Bob.
What lessons from Witkovsky's research should you apply to try and win Wisconsin?
So I have a couple of very nonpartisan, very non-aligned thoughts about this. One is that I do really think that so much of Trump's appeal in 2016 was this positioning as an outsider, positioning as someone who would disrupt the system, drain the swamp, make it all better. And I just don't know that that message is going to play in a re-election, right? Can an incumbent who has wielded the power of the state for 4 years pitch themselves as an outsider? He's had 4 years to drain the swamp. He hasn't done it. Is that going to work? I think there are some Democrats that do have this message of a sort of, sometimes it's outright anti-corruption, and sometimes it's more of a like, we have new voices we can bring to the table. We have something new we can do that I think may play better in this community than a sort of return to normalcy. I worry about a return to normalcy position because I think normalcy hasn't worked out for these communities in the past.
Here's the last question.
That's a lot of pressure.
I believe in you, Mike.
I'd like to know a little bit more about what impelled the switch, the referenda in the mid-50s. When you began talking about that, I was like, well, I thought all those kind of progressive changes were early in the 20th century. So I was really struck that this was happening in the mid-50s, and curious, more relevant probably to what's going on, what you want to take from it is what was going on and how did the reformers win?
Okay, so a few things. I think some of this reform did happen earlier. There was a third form of government, a sort of, what's the word? I don't have it. A commission form of government that was tried in the city in the 1930s, and a mayor that refused to leave office when the commission formed. There was a whole debacle in the 1930s that went to the state Supreme Court and kind of messed things up. And so I think that kind of delayed the council manager push into the 50s because they had tried that in the 30s. There's one answer to your question. I think another answer to your question about why the 50s and not earlier is about World War II. I think on one hand, this is a community, like much of Wisconsin, that had really, really strong German populations. And I think the South Siders that were in power in the 1940s were largely Germans. And I think that flipped some people out. And so part of the 1950s was kind of de-Germanizing, right? Getting rid of that perspective and the need for new capital investment, right? A big part of what happens in the 1950s is the war machinery goes away and there's a need for new industrial investment. And the perspective is that it's elite, it's this kind of council manager, stable, predictable form of government that enables capital investment to happen. I think that's what's going on then instead of earlier. The second part of your question was about now.
It wasn't really about now. It's understanding understanding
Oh, how'd they win?
how they won.
Yeah.
Is relevant to thinking about.
So some of it is simply population, right? There's more people on the north side. There's more people in those wealthier neighborhoods than there are on the south side. That's part of what happened. I also think part of it's the fear of economic decline. I think the way that there's so much that happens in this city and these other cities that is driven by the recognition that one company can leave, one factory can close, and it means kind of economic destitution for a good chunk of the city. And that, I think, has been what gave elites power to kind of create a capital-friendly government. And we definitely see that today still, where there have been threats of corporations that are going to leave, threats of deindustrialization and a lot of power given to local government to negotiate that and make sure it doesn't happen.
Well, with that, I think we'll have to end the evening. So, Professor Olnick, thank you very much for raising a general question.